Hello and welcome back to QubaHQ. My name is Kuba Michalski and boy am I late with this tutorial. You may remember I originally released a trailer for this effect back in June 2010. We're right now nearing the end of the first week of January 2011 and I'm finally getting around to recording it. A lot has happened in this time. I've been really busy, then I've been really lazy. Then my old system died and I got the new one, and then I got busy again and the new system broke and I've been fixing it. Long story short, after 7 months of delay, I'm finally ready to get this thing rolling, so without much further ado, let's get started. Today we'll be disintegrating After Effects 3D layer into particles using highly optimized technique that is going to ensure not only quite spectacular visual results, but also quick calculation. Now, I've seen a lot of tutorials dealing with this subject. They surfaced on the net in the past several months, but so far none of them actually took under the consideration the way in which Trapcode Particular, the plugin that I'm using to create this effect, works. And I think before we get to building this particle system, let me just quickly explain to you what's the deal and why I think my method is much more efficient than the one presented by other tutorials. So let's start with a blank slate in here. We don't really need that preview right now. We'll be building the effect from scratch. And keep in mind, for this portion of the tutorial, you don't really need to follow along. I just want to show you how Particular emits from 3D layers. So let's make a new comp. 720p at 25 frames a second is good. I'm gonna call it temp and immediately create yet another comp, and this time size it to, let's say, 500 by 500 pixels and call it source. Okay, so inside of the source comp I'm going to create a new layer, a new solid layer, color it to, let's say, red, and just drop it inside without changing anything. In the temp I'm going to drag my source layer and turn it off. We don't need to see it. Actually first I can switch it into a 3D layer and maybe just tilt it a little bit so that we can see it is indeed happening in 3D space. Okay, switch this off, create a new solid, and this time we're going to do it comp size. I like to color my particles solids black and call it particles. And on top of the particles we're going to apply Trapcode Particular. Now what we need to do is to hook up our particular into the source layer so it knows where to emit from. So let's go to emitter, change emitter type from point into layer. In here, in layer emitter options, specify that we want to use source, and we can also lower the velocity all the way down to 0 for all the values so our particles don't disperse quickly, and perhaps lower the emitter size in Z into just 1 pixel. That should be fine enough. Finally, I can also lengthen the life of the particles into, let's say, 20 seconds so that we don't get too many of them dying before we can see them properly. So if I scrap the timeline right now, we can see that the particles are indeed being emitted from our source layer. And if we go in and modify the source layer, we'll see that it will reflect in particular. So if I create a new solid in here and let's say color it into green and move it so that it occupies only half of our source, we go back to our temp and we can see that half of our particles are red, half are green. The problem with emitting particles from the 3D layers is that Particular does not really understand whether the alpha of the source is fully opaque or transparent. It will emit particles no matter what. So imagine this scenario. Let's turn off both of our solids. I can turn on transparency grid so we can see what's happening here, and create just a letter A in gray color. Arial is such an ugly font. Let's use Helvetica for that. Helvetica Noi, and let's make it black in terms of thickness and white in terms of color. Okay, so you can see that right now the letter A occupies just a small fraction of the entire source. And if I go back to my temp, I can see something really strange happening. Look at our particular. We're emitting 100 particles a second. Let's go forward to 1 second mark. How many particles can we see on the screen? Just 2. Let's go to 10-second mark. That should be 1,000 particles by then. We merely have around 10. And that's because particular does not understand that all these other pixels of our source layer contain no data, that they are transparent. So if I would bring my red solid back and just lower its transparency a little bit, set it at, let's say, 15%, you can see what's happening. All these particles existed all that time. Particular has been actually emitting 100 particles every second, but most of them were being wasted. And this is exactly why so many of the particular dispersion or particular disintegration methods are so inefficient. Particular will keep on emitting all these invisible particles, and especially when you deal with bounce physics, it will calculate their position, their movement, bouncing off the floor, collisions, and all that, even though they're invisible and you don't see anything on the screen. If I wanted this letter A to become visible right now, let's see how far do we need to push our particular. Let's go to particles and start increasing the amount. Okay, let's say around 2000. Oops, not 200. 2000 is fairly okay to see the letter A. But we're at the 10-second mark and none of our particles died yet. That means we effectively right now have 20,000 particles on the screen. As soon as I go to source and turn on our other layers, let's put it at full opacity again, you can see how many particles we actually created. So that's a lot of wasted computing power, and I'm going to show you how to get around it and only emit particles from the fragments of the image that we need to, effectively speeding up the render at least tenfold. Alright, so let's delete all this stuff in here and have a look at our assets. We have two elements we'll be using. Grunge PSD, if you did any of my previous tutorial, you're probably familiar with. This is this little scratchy image that I usually use to create a floor. And Better Late is the graphic that will be disintegrating, and it's a transparent PNG image, and considering how much I delayed this tutorial, I think the text is only appropriate. Artwork inside of the text is a painting done by my wife. I didn't get the rights to use it in my tutorial, but I'm crossing my fingers so that she does not sue me. And if you like what you see, you can visit her website at chichiland.com, and there is a lot of her works in there and stuff that we do together. You can even buy canvas prints of those pieces. Anyway, let's close this stuff and start our project. Okay, so we're going to start by creating a new composition. This one will be exactly the same as the previous one, which means 720p, 25 frames a second, 20 seconds in length. I know it's a bit long and the whole simulation looks kind of slow-mo, but it's just easier this way. And let's just name it _ main comp, because this is where everything will sit. Now we can look at our assets folder, take our Better Later PNG and create a new comp out of this as well, and maybe drag it out of the assets and rename it into graphic. Actually, source would be probably a better name. Okay, so source it is, and this is where you put whatever you're planning to break into pieces. Now I'm going to duplicate this composition, open it up, delete the graphic from inside. Actually, I didn't duplicate it, I nested it, but it doesn't matter. We just need the empty composition of the same size, and this is the quickest way to do it. And we're going to call this one matte, and this is where our transition will live. So I'm planning to use Luma mattes for revealing things, and basically I'll create a new black solid inside, which will serve as a background, and then a new white solid on very top of it, which will serve as our reveal. Now, since I'm using Luma matte, whatever's white in this matte composition will be visible, will be opaque, and whatever's black will become transparent. So we'll use this comp to animate the disappearance of the original layer. Let's do it right now. Let's give it 2 seconds for establishing camera movement before we start breaking stuff up, and key the position of it. So I can create one position keyframe at 2 seconds, and at 10 seconds move our layer up. So at this point the matte moved out, everything's black, our text would have disappeared. And I'm also going to ease the first keyframe so that the beginning of the animation isn't quite so abrupt. Okay, very complicated. Let's quickly start putting this thing together in our main comp, just so we can see whether it works or not. So I'm going to drag our source, and I'm using it as a 2D layer at this point. We'll switch it all into 3D layers very soon. And on top of that, I'm putting our matte and setting the track matte of our source into Luma matte. So at this point matte was white, everything is visible, and then it starts disappearing. Now the particles will be emitted from the edge of this transition, so we have to identify where it is, and probably the easiest way of doing it would be, okay, this is gonna sound really ridiculous, but matting matte with itself. Okay, let me show you what I mean. Let's drag the matte into new comp icon, so we end up with a new composition with that matte inside. Then duplicate it, use it as a Luma matte for itself, and then offset it. So, excuse me, that shouldn't be Luma matte, that should be Luma inverted matte. Yep. So basically, if they are perfectly aligned, there is a little white or gray line in there, but that's just a rendering error. It shouldn't be there. But as soon as I offset the matte to start 1 second earlier, we can see we have a 1 pixel line traveling upwards, and this is our edge. So let's rename this composition into something a bit more meaningful, such as edge. And although we're not going to be using this particular composition in our main comp, let me just put it in there to show you how it works. So it's traveling together with our reveal animation, or actually unreveal animation, and we'll right now modify it to become a very, very thin comp, and that will become eventually our emitter. Now in the near future I'm planning to do a few more tutorials using this technique, showing you different applications for it, but right now let me just quickly show you why it's set up the way it is and what are the benefits of matting the matte and doing all this craziness rather than just animating a thin solid up and down. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly save this so that we can revert back to this version and go into our original matte layer. Now I'll apply roughen edges into it to create a bit more of a burn style effect. So let's just roughen it up, maybe scale it a little bit up, and animate the evolution from 0 to, let's see, okay, whatever number. So this way we have a bit of a burning effect in here. We can also scale this layer horizontally so that the side edges look clean. Maybe I should just scale it up as well. Alright, let's do it properly. Start from here and in here. Alright. So right now our matte has changed, and if we go to our edge, you will see it automatically adjusts itself and understands that our transition looks different right now. And if we go to our main comp, we can see that indeed we have more of a burn effect right now, but our edge still follows the contours of the transition. And this is really useful. It doesn't really matter what do you use to do the transition. It can be just a sliding layer, it can be an effect, it can be a mask, it can be footage, it could be even text effect. This will always guarantee nice edge detection for you. Additionally, adjusting how much these two are offset allows you to control how thick your edge is. So the more I offset the top layer, the thicker the edge becomes, and the bigger our particular emitter will be. Alright, that's a topic for another lesson though. Let's go back to where we were and continue setting it up. So if I was following any of the other web tutorials, at this point I would probably mat my graphic with this thin line and use it as an emitter. And what we would end up with would be the composition that has a very thin line of pixels that we're actually using and tons of wasted particles. So what we're gonna do is create the emitter that's much thinner and much more efficient. Now let's go towards the end and see how thick this line gets. I don't think it gets much thicker than 2 or 3 pixels. So we can easily create something that's, let's say, 5 pixels tall, and that should be good enough for us. So I'm going to get the edge comp, again pre-comp it into new composition, and call this new one emitter. Yes, we're finally getting there. Right now, what I need to do is resize the emitter. Let's go to composition settings and switch the height from nearly 300 pixels into just 5. And you can see that right now it may become a bit hard to find this white line as it travels through, and keyframing it by hand could be a real pain. So I'm going to go back all the way to matte, where I have my position keyframes, copy them, go to my emitter, where I have my edge and the thin slit that will be emitting particles. Go to 2-second mark, which is where our movement starts, and paste it. But paste it not into position, but into anchor point property. Alright, so now we can see that it's moving at the same speed but in the opposite direction. And the only thing we need to do right now is with the position property move it around until our white line shows. Let's go forward a little bit so we can see it. Okay, where is it? There we go. So this is our white line. And now you can see how it becomes visible. Let's see, do we have any space on top and bottom? I see top is a little bit too close, so let's just move it down a tiny bit. Maybe use full pixels. Okay. But you may say, what's the big deal? Why are we emitting the particles from a white line? Well, that's not exactly what we're going to be doing. I'm going to copy this edge and replace it with our source. So right now we have the source which follows exactly the same movement. And right now it's really simple. We put the source underneath and Luma mat it with the edge. And this way we have the exact data that we need to emit our particles. Now, if you're planning to perhaps adjust the thickness of your emitting edge, etc., you may leave yourself a bit more space in here. I know that I want it to be roughly 1 pixel tall, so that's why I made it really, really thin. I mean, you could have made this emitter, let's say, 10 pixels tall and leave yourself a little bit more wiggle room, but it's not really necessary. Now let's composite this thing back in our main comp. So we're coming here, we can get rid of the edge, we don't need it anymore. And we're gonna bring the emitter in. And right now, of course, the emitter is in totally wrong place, so we need to align it. And again, we will need to adjust its position to move together with our reveal. Now, before we paste any position data into it, let's parent this stuff together so that we have a nice clumped group of things that we can move around and adjust later on. So I'm going to take my emitter and the matte and parent them both to the source, and maybe recolor the source into yellow so it's kind of easier to see in the timeline. And since we want the emitter to move upwards, that's the same direction as our reveal is going. We're pasting it into position rather than anchor point this time. Let's go to 2-second mark again and paste it. Okay, now you may see it's quite a bit offset from the original animation, but right now it's just a matter of adjusting the anchor point and moving it down to align with the original. Now actually this is a good spot because there's sort of 1 pixel pink dot in here that will help us see it. We can switch the emitter temporarily into add mode and just manually put it in the correct position. Okay, there it is. Switch it back to normal and we shouldn't see it at all moving around because right now it's aligned. So if I switch off my source right now, we can see that we have a line that's going to emit particles traveling upwards. It's just 5 pixels tall, so there's gonna be no wasted data and everything is looking pretty sweet. Actually, if we move it fast enough, we probably could even get a kind of laser effect and see what's written in there. Okay, let's not waste time. Source back on, and at this point we can switch all these layers into proper 3D. So before we start emitting the particles, let's build up a scene a little bit so we can get some better space reference. I'm also going to take my source and move its anchor point just below the bottom line, maybe 1 or 2 pixels off. This way it will be just easier to align with the floor. So let's start by creating a camera. Control Shift Alt C, and of course it opens in another window. We can use 35mm preset, we'll probably adjust it. And then for the camera rig I'll need 1, 2, 3 nulls, so Control Shift Alt Y. Let's rename it to Dolly 1 and duplicate it twice. So we link the camera into Dolly 1, Dolly 1 into Dolly 2, and Dolly 2 into Dolly 3, and that's our camera rig. I can just rearrange them here quickly in the timeline so they're more user-friendly for me. And let's create a floor. So that would be a new solid 500 by 500 pixels. Call it floor. White color is fine. Using the ellipse tool and double-clicking it, we can create a nice circle. Move the whole thing to the bottom. Turn on a 3D toggle switch, rotate it by 90 degrees in Y, and now we can start using the dollies to arrange it. So basically my dolly 1 will rotate, oops, the dollies are supposed to be 3D as well. My dolly 1 will put the camera higher and lower. It will work as a crane. And dolly 2, I always mix these two. Dolly 2 will move it and tilt it around the center. Dolly 3 will be used later for creating the mirror reflection that we all love so much. So this is actually good. We get a little bit of an angle. Maybe we can move it closer to the floor, and we can actually bring the camera a bit closer to our subject as well. So let's get the position and the anchor point, move it closer, and perhaps move it up a little bit, and do the same with the point of interest. Okay, so it's relatively centered on the screen. Looking good. Let's get back to our floor. So as usual, I'm gonna scale the bejesus out of it, and I think 10,000% should create a sufficient enough surface. But since I don't want to have this nasty edge at the end, let me just feather it a little bit. I'm pressing Ctrl Shift H to turn off all the helpers so I can see what my composition looks like and then pressing M for masks and playing with feather and expansion. So I want the feather to be probably around 150 pixels, and I'll bring the expansion in a little bit. And this is starting to look fine. I don't need to feather it too much. Let's do 200 and minus 100. I don't need to feather it too much because I'll be using depth of field, so all that stuff will be blurred like hell. We're not gonna be able to see it. Alright, what else do we need here? The floor shouldn't be fully opaque. We probably can escape with around 50 opacity. And I also want my grungy scratches on it. So let's go to Assets, bring the grunge above the floor, turn it into 3D layer, rotate it 90 degrees. Maybe rotate it along Z-axis a little bit. Switch it to add mode, and I like to use it twice, so another one I can scale this one up a little bit and rotate it slightly differently. Okay, so the floor is nice and grungy, and underneath all of that I'm going to create a flat plate, a 2D layer with a gradient on it, just to unify the whole thing a little bit. I think the floor is still too visible. Let's switch it to 25. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so one more solid. I'm calling it background. The color doesn't really matter because we're immediately going to apply ramp on it. And I'm using my usual preset that positions the start point in the center and the end point in the corner. And if you're curious how it's done, just open the project file and see there's a little expression in there that explains it. Okay, so the colors. Let's say the start color is fairly dark and the end color is black. Okay, this is starting to look fine. Now at this point it may be also a good idea to bring in some lights just to get a better overall feel for the scene. So let's create two of those, one slightly cooler, one slightly warmer, and actually a third one behind the camera. So that's a new light, and I see I still have the color of it from the test video. So this is warm light, and let's figure out a good placement for it. And I'm using just a point light, no spots, no shadows, nothing like that. So I guess it's in front. I can't be really sure about it. Let's turn the camera around a bit. Oh yeah, it's quite in front. I can even bring it closer, maybe a bit higher and to the side. So this is my first light, and you can see that the floor right now is nicely dissolving into the background. However, I'm getting a bit of a problem with banding, so it would be a good time to switch from 8 to 16 bit per channel. So Alt click on that, and let's create a second light. So duplicate it, and that would be cool light. I'm going to switch its color into sort of bluish one and lower the strength to, let's say, 50%. Move it to the right of the composition, and perhaps a bit higher and a bit more to the back. The particles will be reacting to the light, and I noticed when I did it originally that the ones that come close to the camera fall kind of out of the influence of these two lights and become simply black, which is not really pretty. That's why I'm going to put one more light behind the camera, and I'm gonna do it by duplicating this warm light. I'm gonna call it cam light, parent it to the camera, and switch the position to 0, 0, 0. So right now it sits exactly on the camera. Now, if I adjust the Z into positive values, it's gonna go in front of camera, so I need to go negative, let's say negative 200, And I can go negative 200 for the Y as well, so it goes a little bit higher. Now this looks a little bit too bright to me, so let's lower the third light into 45%, and this looks just fine. Okay, I mean, this is by no means the finished look. We'll adjust it later on, but now it's time to start working on some other details. If you look carefully, let me just switch off the cam light for a second. The text has become transparent, and this bothered and gave me a headache when I was preparing the preview for quite a while before I figured out what's going on in here. The deal is our text is matted with the alpha matte that comes from this layer, which is right now invisible. And this layer reacts to the lights. So it's bright and almost white in the left top corner, making our text nice and opaque in here. But as it falls out of the range of the light, it becomes darker and darker, rendering our text transparent. So what we need to do is unroll the material options for the matte layer and make sure that it does not react to lights. So we go to accept shadows and accept lights and switch both of those off. And right now we have nice 100% opacity on our text, and everything seems to be working fine. So with all this stuff set in place, it's finally time for the particles. You're probably asking yourself, what the hell, I've been watching this thing for half an hour, he still hasn't put a single particle in the comp. Well, the time has come. Alright, so let's go to the 2-second mark where we will start emitting particles. And first of all, collapse, 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 collapse. Get our emitter and trim it in here. I mean, it doesn't really need to emit anything before. And also maybe switch the color to, let's say, green, so we can see it well on the timeline. And create a new solid, call it particles 1. Color doesn't matter, I like to make it black, and that goes on top of everything. And right now we're ready to start setting it up. So of course I didn't apply the plugin yet. Trapcode particular. Why do I have all these text panels in here? I don't need them. Alright, Trapcode particular. You can see that this is a vanilla install of CS3. I have like one plugin installed. I switched to CS5 quite a while ago. Well, 2 plugins. I have Video Copilots, Optical Flares as well. Alright. So, we're done. It looks beautiful, don't you think? The particles are emitting, the text is disappearing. Thank you very much and goodbye. Or not. Alright. Emitter. Emitter type. Layer. Velocity at this point. Everything down to 0. Emitter size in Z. I'm gonna give it, let's say, 10 pixels. Let's see if it works. And particle, whoops, not particle, emitter layer, emitter. Okay, now we're talking. So this looks absolutely dreadful right now, but we can see that it's starting to work. Now you can see that our particles are blinking a lot right now. And that's because we set layer sampling to the default, which is current time, and we want to switch it to particle birth time. So the particle gets born, it gets its color sampled from the emitter, and then doesn't change. And now this looks much better. So I mean, if I just increase the amount of particles right now, we can see that our text is turning into kind of a puffy, woolly look. But that's not what we're after. Let's create a custom particle for this purpose. Let's go to Project, New Composition, 100 by 100 pixels, and call it Custom Particle Shapes. And fortunately we don't need too many of them, So we're going to set the duration of the comp to 10 frames. Not 10 seconds, 10 frames, very short. Alright, and inside we're going to create a white solid. We don't really need to name it, we're not going to be coming back in here. And with a mask, just draw some shapes that change on every frame. So this way we'll have some interesting variation in the particle shapes. So that would be the first one. Let's keyframe it, go to the next frame. And basically in here you just do whatever you want as long as the shapes are different from one another. What the hell am I doing? It should be fine. So maybe something like this, maybe one that's really thin and then kind of weird, another one that's more bulky and squarey or diamondy. I'm imagining, I'm inventing new geometric shapes in here. I see a boomerang or a heavy metal logo, letter C. Another one. We can also do some triangles. Another one. Almost done. Now this is not really necessary. You could just use default circles, but in case your camera is going to look at the particles in detail, this is going to help add some believability to your effect. Alright, I think I'm fine with them. Just in case anything messes up with the frame rate and sampling, I'm gonna select all the keyframes and switch it to toggle halt keyframe. So no interpolation to be seen in here. Go away. Custom shapes. Let's drop it at the bottom of our composition and switch its visibility off. So back to our particular settings. We set up the emitter. It's looking good. The colors are not quite exactly what they're supposed to be, but there's a reason for that. We're right now not obeying the lights. Particularly, it has the shading switched off. If we go there and switch the shading on, it looks too dark, but that's because right now the light fall off is set to natural. If we switch it to After Effects default, we get pretty close results. And that's again, right now we're dealing with the non-3D particles. I mean, they are located in a 3D space, but they are not 3D themselves. I talk too much sometimes. Alright, let's go to particle, switch type into textured polygon colorize, and in the texture panel choose our custom particle shapes, and then time sampling random still frame. So it's basically going to grab a random frame. Let me switch those off again. It's going to grab a random frame. Each particle will be different. To randomize it a bit further, we can switch the size. Those are way too big right now. Let's switch the size to 2 and maybe increase the randomness to, let's say, 50. And then go to rotation, if I can only remember. There it is. And we don't want them to be born with random rotation, because if we do that, let me just turn it on, we're gonna get a lot of dark ones that we really don't want. So I'm gonna set the random rotation to maybe something around 5, so there's a little bit of variety. And then random speed rotate. Now I don't remember what value worked for me. I think I'll set it to 0.5. And this is a good beginning. Why don't we preview it a little bit and just see what's happening? Now I know there's way too few particles right now. Wait a second, we don't need to preview the first 2 seconds. There's way too few particles. I think I used 2 layers with 20,000 particles each in my preview, so we're gonna fix it very soon. But for now, this is starting to look good. I just want to see whether they rotate fast enough or slow enough or not at all. Okay, I think we could speed up the rotation a little bit. That was barely moving in there. So again, rotation, it's set at 0.5. Let's just set it at 1. And that should be fine. I mean, I'm gonna increase the amount of particles as pretty much the last step, because we want to be able to preview it. Now, when I did it in After Effects CS5, I could fairly easily handle quite large amounts of particles without much hassle. But as per your request, I'm using an older version of After Effects and it doesn't utilize my computer's potential. So let's just make sure that we keep it easy for now. So onto the physics panel. Let's go to, actually in here, physics. And we want to switch the physics model into bounce. Set the floor as our bounce layer. At bounce 50, 30, 80. I think I'm going to lower it to 30 for this batch of particles. And that should be correct. Additionally, we want to introduce gravity to the mix. And at this point I don't remember what was the value I used. Let's start with 10 and see where it takes us. So again, this is gonna be a bit of a trial and error, because being a very smart person I am, I totally forgot to take any notes for the values I used in the preview. So we'll basically be trying and seeing what happens. Okay, so after consulting the original file, I figured the settings are as follows. Gravity is set to 10, physics time factor is set to 2.0, and bounce, bounce random, and slide are set at 50, 20, and 100 respectively. And that produces a fairly nice result, making the particles fall down in quite realistic fashion. So it looks like our layer is indeed turning into sand. Now let's get back to our emitter and adjust some settings in here. Now I set the initial velocity to 0, and that's because I really don't want it to look like those particles are flying out. I want it to look like my original layer is breaking apart and slowly dripping down. But that results in all these particles basically, let's move the camera for a moment here, falling straight down, totally flat, and not making it very interesting. So I'm just going to add a tiny bit of movement to this by increasing velocity to something like 2 perhaps. You see, we can already see that it's getting spread a little. Yes, correct. Velocity random to 50. And direction to directional with the offset of 90 on X rotation. So our particles are pointing down. They have a bit of spread. That's the original spread value of 20. They're going down, spreading themselves a little bit and creating basically a bit more of a 3D effect. Now this by itself is not going to sell it. Let's go a bit ahead to see how it looks. It's still not going to sell it because they're falling flat down. So we're going to have to add another layer with secondary particles, and those are going to be the ones that are flying around crazy. Now for this one we just need few more adjustments. Let's set the amount of particles a second to maybe 10,000. Let's see how that looks. Better, definitely. I mean, we can see this thing turning into pieces. And particle life, I want to set it to, let's say, 6 seconds. So they have time to reach the floor and bounce a little bit before they die. Now this of course starts increasing the render times. And this is starting to look really ugly right now, but don't worry about it. For our velocity, actually randomness should be at something like 100. Let's set also the size randomness. We already have it. But the initial size could be 1.5, a bit smaller, since we have quite more of them right now on the screen. Alright, and what was the last setting that I needed to adjust? Of course, it was the size over life. We don't want the particles to simply disappear at their death. We want them to fade away into nothingness slowly. So that's in size over life, but we need to use our effect controls panel to access this graph. Let's go to particle, size over life, choose this preset, which kind of eases it in and out, and then flatten the beginning. So our particles will be born at full size and then slowly get smaller towards the end of their lifespan. Okay, this is starting to look fairly good. We could also switch the life randomness to, let's say, 60%, because right now they're all being born and dying exactly at the same time, which creates this very ugly shape. Now this is starting to look better. And also perhaps we can switch the direction to outwards and set it to 100%, so they disperse just a little bit more. And again, we need to wait for the preview. Boy, do I hate CS3 right now. Okay, this is looking pretty good. I'm gonna increase the particles per second towards the end of this tutorial. Let me just once again go through the settings, see if everything looks correct. Yes, there is one thing we forgot, which is the visibility. And we want our original layer to obscure the particles. And why is that? Is our secondary ones, which will be a copy of this one, will fly in every which direction, and we just want it to look correct. So obscuration layer is going to be our source. I don't particularly like how this transition looks right now. The place where of course I need to wait for it to render. The place where our particles are being born and our original layer disappears. It's very straight and visible. So what I'm gonna do is go to 2 seconds time mark, trim my particles because I don't really need that layer before that time, and then grab both the particles and my emitter and just nudge it to start 1 frame earlier. That means the particles will be a little bit ahead of our edge, and it will result in more believable result. Additionally, just to make that edge a bit less visible and a little bit less recognizable, let's go to our matte and blur it a little bit. So let's go to Gaussian blur, just vertical, and I think 1.5 pixel should be enough. Yeah, so that's going to smooth it out a little bit. Alright, so we have our first particle set ready. You know what? Let's just turn it on completely and then disable it. So I mean, you can see that it's starting to take some time to render, but at the same time you can see that the text is still readable even though it's falling down as particles right now. So I'm gonna switch it to 20,000 particles per second, which for this thing is quite ridiculous, and it calculates for a while because those are 3D polygons flying down, reacting to lights, etc. Then I'm going to key this value, go 1 frame ahead to the time code of 10 seconds and 1 frame, and switch off the emission. So we don't need to emit any particles after that point. And now let's get back a little bit and create that secondary particle emitter. So duplicate particles 1, or we can even call it realistic particles, which are unfortunately less exciting, and then extra particles, in which we're going to add some motion to them so that they fly around and basically fill up the screen better. So for that, let's go to our emitter properties and increase the velocity to, let's say, 50 with the randomness of 100 as well. And you can see that right now we're getting a nice spread. They are still bouncing around from the floor, but this is starting to look much better. And keep in mind, right now I switched off our other particles layer. If we turn both of them on, we'll have both the realistic ones going straight down and the messy ones, making it more exciting after half an hour of wait. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We're almost set in here. Okay, let's just switch off the realistic particles for a moment and do few more adjustments to our, what did we call it? Exciting particles? Extra particles. First thing is, I want them to be still visible at around 19-second mark, and for that I have to increase the life. I can also increase the emitter size, but I don't need to do that. I don't actually need to do that. Sorry, it's taking a while, but this is typical with creating effects in After Effects that are emulating more complex 3D stuff. What would happen if I switched it to uniform? Would that look any better? Actually it does, I think. So I'm gonna set it at uniform. So basically these ones are flying in every which direction. And I can also increase gravity just a tiny bit on these ones, so they don't quite fly around so much. We were supposed to increase their lifespan, so let's go to 19 seconds and think about it. If we stop emitting particles at the 10-second mark and we want them to continue for 9 seconds, their life should be around 9 seconds. But we also have randomness on it. Where do we have the particle properties? Have the randomness of how much? 60%. Okay, let's see what happens if I type 15. This is good. Are they still there at the end? A few. Okay, maybe 14. Alright, so this way we get those secondary particles still kind of bouncing around and sliding at the very end of the comp. So this is all looking pretty good. I think we're set with our particles at this point. Let's just turn both of them on and go somewhere earlier in time when there's quite not so many of them on screen at the same time, and do some final adjustments. So first of all, the camera movement. And actually for camera movement I should switch off the particles, go to the beginning and play with the dollies. No, not what you think, it's not dolls, it's camera nulls. Okay, so we're gonna be using some depth of field, so it's nice to have the camera close to the ground. It really gives a better result. Is the rotation at absolute 0? Does it mean I never needed that one? Okay, let's give it some validation by just changing it to -2 and set up the position. So we would start somewhere here perhaps, and actually I should see the layer and go there. Okay, move it to the end of the comp, select both of them and F9 them. So okay, we have some movement, and in here all the craziness will happen. Now one more thing that you should remember is, remember how I moved the anchor point, let's just show it, the anchor point of this layer just a little bit below the bottom? If I haven't done that and this has been sitting straight on the ground, so would the emitter, and the first batch of particles would spawn on the same height as the floor. And since we're supposed to bounce them, they need to be a little bit above the floor. Otherwise, they would basically fall through and create a very weird beginning to the animation. So that's why we have this thing offset a little bit to the top. So we have the camera motion. Now let's give this thing a little bit of a thickness. So we can go to our source and matte, duplicate the whole thing, move it below, and to our second source that we just copied, we can just generate a fill. Let's give it a light gray color and offset it a little bit, I think. No more than 2 pixels. So that is gonna give us some nice depth in there. Maybe this should be brighter. Ctrl Shift Y. Come on. Ah, of course it's not a null. A little brighter. Yep. And maybe minus 1.5 instead of 2. Yeah, so this way this doesn't look quite so flat. Another thing is we can add a bit of a fake shadow in here to make it look more believable, as if it's standing here. Now, since the particles don't emit shadows in here, we want to have some contact space at the bottom of the text. So for that, just going to create a new solid, say 500 by 100 pixels, color it black, move it underneath our texts but above the grunge layers, turn it into 3D, rotate it by 90 degrees, apply a circular mask to it, and then apply a blur to it. So effect, blur and sharpen. It could be fast blur, but I just prefer Gaussian one. Let's increase it and see how it looks. Okay, this is fairly good. Let's lower the opacity to maybe 40 and rescale it a little bit, so it could be a bit thicker and quite a bit longer. Yeah, this looks like it's sitting much better. Maybe we can change it to, let's say, color burn to feel a little bit better. And I would like to have some depth of field in this as well. So let's go to camera properties, camera options, turn on the depth of field, and let's see, our camera is around 850 pixels away from the subject. So focus distance 845, let's say. Aperture up to 50 and blur level 150. Okay, this is nice. This is blurring our foreground and a bit of a background, but not damaging the text too much. I see that the ground level is still a bit too strong, so I want to fix that one very quickly. Let's go to floor, first look at that mask it has. Maybe the feather should be just 100 and we should just bring it in a bit closer. Mask expansion, let's lower it further. Okay, this is much nicer. Maybe a bit more. Okay. And is there anything else? Ah, yes. Lens flares. So for lens flares, as usual, I'm gonna bow to Mr. Andrew Kramer and use his Video Copilot Optical Flares, which, in my humble opinion, has no substitute at this point. So let's call it Flares. Apply the effect. And where is the damn preset that I use for all the works in this set of tutorials? I believe it was blue steel. It may not be in this folder. Blue steel, there we go. That's the preset I've been using since I started those tutorials. Let's switch the mode from 2D into track lights. Switch the transfer mode of this layer into add. And perhaps lower the scale and brightness a little bit, so both of them at 75, let's say. Alright, and the final thing is I think it really needs some color adjustment. It's really kind of dull right now. So let's create a new adjustment layer. Actually no, adjustment layer will come in a moment. Let's just have a look if everything is fine here with the particles. So let's come maybe here, turn our particles back on, and wait 5 hours for it to preview. Okay, well, it wasn't 5 hours, it certainly wasn't fast either, but we can see that right now our particles are obeying the depth of field, everything is looking nice. So, last few steps, select all the layers, enable motion blur on them, and let's go to the first frame. I don't want to wait for those previews. And then grab our main comp, create a copy of it, rename it into reflections, and use our oldest trick in the book, which is find dolly 3, which is the top of all the chain of command, camera, dolly 1, dolly 2, and dolly 3. Select scale and scale it into -100 in Y. Boom, very nice. Now, although the layer may seem like they disappeared, we want to switch them off anyway, so we don't want no flares on this one. We don't want our black solid here, which is the shadow. And we don't want any of the floor and background stuff. Alright. Back to main comp. Bring our reflections, composite them underneath the floor, between the floor and background basically. Nice, and we can see that there is a little bit of space in here, but we don't care. I want to switch the mode of reflections into screen, turn on the motion blur, lower its opacity to, let's say, 50. Blur it a little bit as well. I don't want the reflections to be so sharp. I mean, it's after all quite a dirty texture. And talking about dirty texture, maybe we can scale those a little bit down because we're kind of starting to lose the detail on them. Yeah, this is much nicer. So, reflections, Gaussian blur. And I'm really talking minuscule amount. Probably 2 pixels will be too much even. No, 2 pixels is just about right. So it just doesn't feel so CGI, it feels a bit more real. And also we wanted to fade towards the edges, so let's apply a mask, this time a rectangular one. Turn on our helper so we can see it. Increase the feather, but only vertical one, to, let's say, 100. What have I done? I think I hit the wrong key. 100 feather, and just move it up a little bit. Okay, this is looking fine. So right now our floor became a bit more muddy and the reflection looks much better. And just a bit of color correction, nothing fancy. I think I'm just gonna adjust the contrast on it. So let's go to layer, new adjustment layer, call it CC for color correction, and I think I'm just gonna use curves. Really no need to do anything else here right now. So curves, bring it down a little bit, maybe crash the blacks a tiny bit. Okay, this is much nicer. Alright, so it seems our project is complete. I will however not render it in After Effects CS3. This would take too much time right now. So I'm saving it, and this is the file that you're going to get together with the project file, but I'll now load it up into CS5 because it's gonna render much faster, and I'll see you on the other side. And I'm back in CS3 for one more thing. I went to CS5, rendered the whole thing, and realized I forgot about one little detail about this project, which is as this text was disintegrating into particles, after a while it was also supposed to start going down, kind of as if it's collapsing and losing its ground, and we never did that, so let me quickly add that animation into this thing. Okay, so let's switch off the extra particles for this purpose, so it doesn't take quite too long to do that. So let's simply go to our source layer in the main comp. We can also link the other source into it, so we don't have to do it twice. Go to around the perhaps 4-second mark. Why is it so slow? Oh, it's so slow because it's rendering the particles in the reflections, of course. Let's switch off the reflections temporarily. And let's see, possibly at around 5-second mark, when the first, or rather the last line of text has disappeared, we can just add the position keyframe and go ahead to, let's say, just before 10 frames and move it down a bit. So this keyframe would be at 10, and this one will have an F9 on it, and this way the whole thing starts collapsing nicely. I mean, I can move it down even further. Let's see, we don't have any clipping. Yeah, this looks good. And since all our emitters and everything are nicely parented, everything will work fine. I mean, we can just verify it by soloing the emitter. It's still in place. So let's get those two keyframes. Make sure that we're at the exact 5-second mark. Yes. Go to reflections and repeat the process in here. So connect the bottom source to the top source, reveal position, and just paste those keyframes in here. Alright, so if we go back to main comp right now, turn the reflections back on, and turn the particles back on, after a bit of wait we should get the exact result we were looking for. So let's just skip to an 8-second mark. I'm gonna pause the video and let it crunch through the frame. So okay, yeah, the render is complete. I mean, the single frame render is complete, and everything is looking just right. So why don't I right now bring it to CS5, render the whole thing, and then we'll talk again. Alright, so although I switched to much more powerful CS5, this thing still was taking quite a long time to render, so I made two further adjustments for both extra particles and realistic particles, both in main comp and in reflections. I lowered the amount of generated particles from 20,000 to 10,000, and that seemed to do a trick, and the finished render looks something like this. I think it's pretty close to what we set out to do. I'm certainly quite happy with the results. You can see there is some weird artifacting happening right now with some of the particles still being obscured by a layer that's already gone. You can see it happening here. Now this didn't happen in the first composition I did. I'm not quite sure why it's here, so I'm going to include two project files with this project, and you can basically analyze both of them and figure out how you want to do this project and what you want to do with it. Now, I'm hoping the next tutorial will be sooner than 6 months later. I'm planning to do a few more tutorials on this particular technique of disintegrating layers, but this time concentrating a little bit more on content rather than just the technique. Until then, for QubaHQ, I'm Kuba Michalski, and I'll see you next time.